Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on how economic impacts were estimated for North Dakota's 89 public use airports. If you have not already done so, it would be a good idea for you to have a copy of the study's Economic Impact Methodology Guide. Also, you should have a copy of your airport's specific economic impacts. This information is also provided on this drive. If you are ready, let's get started. This tutorial will help you have a better understanding of three things: what specific activities contribute to your airport's economic impact, what data sources were used to estimate your airport's economic impact, and what methodology and assumptions were used to estimate your airport's economic impact. It is important to remember that most people who see an airport's reported annual economic impact see only the grand total, or the big number. Sometimes the big number can be confusing and off-putting if the person is not familiar with what this number really represents. Using information in this tutorial, you will be in a better position to explain the individual components of the big number, and you will be able to discuss with others how the big number was estimated for your airport. For the next few slides, it would be helpful if you can have your airport's reported economic impacts from the study so you can follow along. Economic impacts presented in the study for your airport fall into three categories: direct impacts, indirect impacts, and total impacts. Your airport's total impacts are simply a sum of your airport's direct and indirect impacts. All direct impacts of your airport start with activities at the airport or with other activities that airport supports, such as visitor travel. All direct impacts presented in the study were obtained through study-specific interviews and surveys. Indirect impacts for your airport are a result of direct impacts. If there are no direct impacts, there will not be any indirect impacts. When direct impacts enter the economy, they create additional economic impacts. Indirect impacts are sometimes referred to as multiplier impacts. In this study, your airport's indirect impacts were estimated with an input-output model. Both direct and indirect impacts are discussed in more depth as part of this tutorial. For all general aviation airports, economic impacts are associated with one of four categories: airport management, airport tenants, capital investment, or spending from visitors arriving in North Dakota on general aviation planes. For the commercial airports, they also have impacts from these four categories, but have additional benefits that come from the spending of visitors who arrive on commercial airline flights. Let's talk briefly about each of these impact categories. We will discuss economic impacts from airport management first. Airport management includes all activities associated with airport operation, administration, and routine maintenance. There are a few pieces of information that may be useful to you related to economic impacts associated with airport management. First, not all airports have impacts in the airport management category. Second, jobs reported in the airport management category are a roll-up of all on- and off-airport jobs, and of all full-time, part-time, and seasonal jobs. It is important to remember this, especially if you are questioned on your airport's number of direct jobs reported in the airport management category. Just remember, these may not be employees who report to the airport for work every day. For airport tenants, there are businesses at an airport that are engaged in providing services to aircraft or services to airport customers. There are a few pieces of information that may also be useful related to economic impacts associated with airport tenants. Many general aviation airports do not have airport tenants, so they will not have impacts in this category. If an airport has tenants that are not aviation related, the impacts for these businesses are not included in the study. Many airports undertake capital improvement projects to expand, improve, or rehabilitate their facilities. There are a few pieces of information that may be useful to you related to economic impacts associated with capital investment. First, investment is most often supported by grants that come from the state or the FAA. But investment is also made by cities, counties, and private entities, especially for hangar development. Second, because airports do not undertake a capital project each year, a 3-year average of capital investments for each airport was used to estimate annual impacts in this category. Third, impacts in the capital investment last only while the actual spending is taking place. Once projects are implemented and spending is completed, impacts in this category cease, unless, of course, another project is ready to start. Impacts in all other categories are more ongoing in nature. Most, but not all, airports support impacts related to spending from visitors who arrive in North Dakota on general aviation planes. Commercial airports have visitor spending impacts from both visitors arriving on general aviation planes and on commercial airline flights. A few pieces of information on visitor spending. First, most all visitors arriving on commercial airline flights are spending for lodging and food, and many have expenditures for ground transportation, retail shopping, and/or entertainment. Second, some general aviation visitors have similar expenditures, but many visitors who travel on general aviation aircraft stay only for the day and have little or no spending in the community they visit. For all airports, annual economic impacts are quantified using 3 factors. These 3 factors are: Number 1, the jobs the airport and its operations and services support. Number 2, the payroll that is associated with these jobs. And number 3, annual output. While jobs and payroll are easy to understand, output is less transparent. It is quite possible that when you discuss your airport's economic impact, you will be asked to explain output. To make output more transparent and easy to understand, output can be explained as follows. For airport management and airport tenants, output is equal to the amount spent each year to purchase goods and services to run the airport or run the business. For capital improvements, output is equal to the average annual amount invested to improve or expand the airport. For visitors arriving by air, output is equal to the amount visitors spend each year while they are in North Dakota. Boiling down output to these common sense descriptions is important to your ability to successfully explain their estimated annual economic impact to your airport. As explained, each airport's economic impacts are categorized as direct or indirect. The next few slides take a deeper dive into explaining direct economic impacts. Since the process to collect and estimate direct economic impacts for airport management and airport tenants is similar, we are going to discuss direct economic impacts for these 2 categories together. Just to refresh, for airport management and airport tenants, direct impacts were collected for jobs, payroll, and output. As a reminder, output for both categories is equal to annual purchases of goods and services to support the airport or the business. For both categories, direct employment, payroll, and output were collected using surveys and interviews that were conducted specifically for this study. All direct impact data for each airport came from a North Dakota airport representative. In addition, each airport furnished a list and contacts for all of their tenants. This information was confirmed with each airport before it was used in the study. In some instances, third-party data sources such as Dun & Bradstreet or Manta were used to verify tenant employment. All tenants were contacted either in person, by mail, by email, or by phone. In many cases, more than one method was used to obtain a tenant response. Let's look at an example of direct impacts for airport management. This example would be for a smaller general aviation airport. It would be a good idea for you to follow along, looking at your airport's direct impacts in the airport management category. In this example, there are 2 full-time airport management jobs. Don't forget, these jobs may not be full-time positions located at the airport. The jobs may be a combination of part-time and seasonal employment. Also, not all jobs are necessarily physically located at the airport. Many airports get services such as accounting, legal, human resources, and maintenance from a city or a county. The airport supports only a percentage of the jobs in these categories, but if an employee in each of these 4 categories spends 25% of their time, for example, working for the airport, These 4 part-time jobs would represent 1 full-time job. In the example, the direct payroll shown is a sum of the salaries for all employees. For direct output, this is the amount the airport reported as being spent each year to purchase goods and services to run the airport. A further point of information to understand direct output reported for airport management. The output does not reflect payroll, nor does it reflect any local share of capital investment that may be made to leverage federal or state grants. Now, let's go over a similar example of direct impacts for airport tenants at an airport. Again, it would be helpful for you to look at the direct impacts for tenants at your airport. Remember, some general aviation airports will not have reported impacts in this category because they have no aviation-related business operating at their airport. Examples of aviation-related tenants include FBOs, flight instructors, aerial applicators, airlines, rental cars, concessionaires, aircraft rental or charter, aircraft sales, and other similar businesses. When you look at the direct employment for your airport in the tenant category, this employment is the sum of total jobs reported for all tenants. In our example, the number of reported direct jobs is 5. This number of jobs could be for 1 tenant, or it could be 1 job for 1 business and 2 jobs for 2 other businesses. Tenant impacts were combined to protect the confidentiality of information the tenants provided. The technical report has a list of reported tenants and the number of direct jobs assigned to each tenant, if you need to further dissect your airport's reported tenant impacts. In this example, the $250,000 in direct payroll is the annual salary reported for all 5 jobs. The $540,000 in direct output is the combined operating budgets for all tenants. One thing that might be of value, if you get questions on direct output for tenants, is that if you have an aerial applicator based at your airport, their cost to do business, buy goods and services, tends to push the direct output number up. Again, in this example, output does not include payroll, nor does it include any investment that may have been made to complete a capital improvement project. Now let's talk about economic impacts that come from capital investment. Just as a refresher, impacts in this category are related to spending for improvement projects at the airport. When you look at your airport's direct output in the capital investment category, this number is the average, not the sum, of what has been reportedly invested to improve your airport over the past 3 years. A few points to remember about impacts in the capital investment category. Number 1. Investments can change year to year, so impacts in this category can also vary significantly. Number 2. To smooth out the variance, a 3-year average for capital investment at each airport was used to estimate direct impacts in this category. Number 3. Direct capital investment reported to your airport includes, as appropriate, grants from NDAC or FAA. It also includes the local funds used to leverage these grants. Some airports also had investment from private sources, primarily to build hangars. The 3-year average for direct output or spending in the capital investment category considers all of these sources as they are applicable to each airport. Number 4. It is important to remember that jobs and payroll in this category are temporary in nature. Once the spending to complete the project ends, the impacts also cease, unless there is another capital project ready to start. Number 5. Since economic impact studies are a snapshot in time, if economic impacts are estimated every 5 years, there is a propensity for impacts in this particular category to change, more so than in the other categories. Okay, so we know that in the capital investment category, direct output is equal to the 3-year average of the capital investment at each airport. If we know that over 3 years, an airport has had capital investment that averaged $392,000, this becomes our direct output number. If you look at your airport's direct output in the capital investment category, that number is the 3-year average for spending for all projects at your airport. Once we have the direct output estimate, an input-output model is used to tell us how many jobs that output or spending supports while it is taking place. And the model tells us what the estimated salary would be for these jobs. For this study, the Implant Input-Output model was used to convert direct output for capital investment into the jobs and payroll that the spending or direct output supports. We'll talk a little more about the model used in the study later in this tutorial. The model in this particular example indicates that for every $100,000 spent in the capital investment category, one job is supported. This one job can be spread out among many categories, such as engineering, planning and design, permitting, and actual construction. In this example, the $392,000 in average annual capital investment divided by $100,000 shows that while projects were actually being implemented, 3.92 jobs were supported. In this analysis, the 3.92 jobs were rounded to 4 full-time direct jobs in the capital investment category. The average annual salary across all categories for the 4 jobs that are supported is $65,000. So the 4 full-time direct jobs support direct payroll in this example of $260,000. This slide shows what the direct impacts that we just discussed for the capital investment category look like when they are reported in the study. You may wish to compare this example to direct capital investment impacts reported for your airport. It is worth noting that there are a few small airports that reportedly had no capital investment over the past 3 years. As a result, these airports have no direct impact reported in this category. For all other airports, the results are based on average annual capital investment at your airport over the past 3 years. Most airports have direct economic impacts that come from visitors who arrive in North Dakota on a general aviation plane. Direct impacts in this category can be found at both general aviation and commercial airports. It is important to remember for this category, direct output is equal to all annual spending from these visitors. In order to estimate direct impacts from general aviation visitor spending, it was first necessary to estimate annual general aviation visitors for each of the 89 airports. Estimates of general aviation visitors for each airport are not available from another existing data source. A considerable amount of effort was expended as part of the study to develop realistic estimates of the number of general aviation visitors that arrive in North Dakota using each of the 89 public use airports. All airports provided information that was used to support their specific general aviation visitor estimates. Specific bottom-up estimates of visitors were developed for each airport. A rule-of-thumb approach was not used to estimate general aviation visitors, as this type of approach can result in over- or underestimating impacts in this category. Each airport helped to develop their estimate of general aviation visitors, and each airport reviewed these estimates before they were used in the study to estimate impacts in the general aviation visitor category. We are now going to go over the steps that were taken for each airport to estimate the number of visitors arriving each year on general aviation planes. In this discussion, it is worth noting that visiting aircraft are also sometimes referred to as transient aircraft. The steps in this study to estimate general aviation visitors were as follows. Each airport estimated their number of weekly visiting general aviation aircraft. Then each airport estimated the mix of these weekly visiting aircraft, if they were single-engine, multi-engine, or jet. Next, each airport provided an estimate of the typical number of visitors arriving on each aircraft type. Weekly visiting general aviation aircraft were translated into annual visiting general aviation aircraft arrivals, multiplying weekly arrivals by 52. Annual visiting arrivals were then compared to each airport's total annual itinerant arrivals. Annual itinerant operations for each airport were obtained from FAA records and were divided by 2 to get itinerant arrivals. Annual visiting operations should always be less than the total itinerant operations. Itinerant operations are conducted by both visiting and based aircraft. In the event that visiting activity was estimated to be higher than the total annual itinerant activity, further discussion with the airport was undertaken. All general aviation visitor estimates were shared with each airport before they were used in the study to estimate economic impacts in the general aviation visitor category. Let's walk through an actual example of how general aviation visitors were estimated for all 89 airports. If an airport indicated that they have 10 visiting aircraft that come to their airport each week, 10 weekly visiting aircraft times 52 weeks equals 520 visiting aircraft arrivals or departures each year. For those 520 visiting aircraft, the airport provided the mix of the planes and the number of visitors typically carried on each type of plane. In this example for our 10 planes, 2 planes, or 20% of the visiting aircraft, were jets. Each jet typically carried 6 visitors. This yields 624 annual visitors. 3 of the planes, or 30% of the visiting planes each week, were twin-engine planes, typically carrying 3 visitors. This yields another 468 general aviation visitors. The remaining 5 planes, or 50% of the total, of the 10 weekly visiting aircraft were single-engine planes that carried on average 2 visitors, adding another 502 general aviation visitors. So for this example, 624 plus 468 plus 502 equals 1,594 total annual general aviation visitors. Information for each airport's estimate of annual general aviation visitors can be found in the study's technical report. Once an estimate of general aviation visitors for each airport was developed, it was necessary to determine how much these visitors spent while in North Dakota. With the assistance of more than 60 airports and FBOs around the state, surveys were distributed to general aviation visitors to obtain information on their spending patterns. General aviation spending patterns vary by airport. Study surveys revealed that many general aviation visitors come to North Dakota for just the day and have limited or no spending in the community they visit. For those visitors who do have spending, visitor spending patterns were developed for each airport. General aviation visitor spending patterns used in the study considered all of the following: survey results, the airport's attributes, which include facilities and services. More developed airports tend to have visitors who stay longer and spend more. The size and the location of the community the airport serves were also considered to establish visitor spending patterns. Some study airports also have transient aerial applicators who come to the community to operate for several months each year. Local spending for lodging and food for these applicators was included in the visitor spending category. Let's go over an example of how direct visitor spending economic impacts were estimated in the study. First of all, remember for the general aviation visitor category that direct output is equal to total annual general aviation visitor spending. In our example, we have a total of 1,594 general aviation visitors who arrive in North Dakota each year using our example airport. Our survey and research data shows that on average, each of these visitors spend $60 during their entire trip. Remember, this is the average spending per visitor trip. The average takes into account a high percentage of general aviation visitors who arrive at the airport but spend nothing in the local community while they are there. The average also considers visitors who come and stay for several days, maybe spending as much as $1,000 during their trip. For general aviation visitors, average spending per visitor trip tends to be on the lower side because there is a high percentage of visitors that come only for the day and spend nothing in the local community. When the 1,594 annual general aviation visitors are multiplied times the average spending of $60 per visitor trip, total direct general aviation output of $95,640 is estimated. Don't forget that for this category, annual general aviation visitor spending is the same as direct output. Similar to the capital investment category, once we have estimates of direct output or spending for general aviation visitors, we can estimate the number of direct jobs and direct payroll that this output or spending supports. For our example, we have $95,460 in direct output or annual general aviation visitor spending. The input-output model is again used to determine the number of jobs and payroll this spending supports. In this example, the model indicates that $85,000 in visitor spending supports one job. So in our example, $95,460 divided by $85,000 shows that the spending supports one full-time job. This job is most likely in the hotel or food services industries and has an average salary of $25,000. For our general aviation visitor spending example, the 1,594 visitors spent $95,460, which according to the Input-Output model supports one direct job that had a direct payroll of $25,000. You can view the estimate of direct general aviation visitor economic impact for your own airport. The example that we have discussed would be for a smaller general aviation airport. Many airports have general aviation visitor impacts that are significantly higher than this example. But there are also a few study airports that had no measurable impact in this category. The process to estimate direct economic impacts for commercial visitor spending is very similar to the process used to estimate direct economic impacts for general aviation visitor spending. Direct output in this category is also equal to annual visitor spending. Impacts in this category are only applicable to the 8 commercial airports. Each airport's annual employments were used to estimate the airport's commercial visitors. Visitors are a percentage of each airport's total employments. The remainder of the employments are residents. For this study, airports and the North Dakota Aeronautics Commission provided annual employments. The percent of each airport's employments that are visitors versus residents was obtained from US DOT data. Since commercial service was suspended for a while for both Jamestown and Devils Lake, their annual employments were estimated using actual employments for the first 4 months of activity after service was reinstated. Visitors to North Dakota arriving on a commercial airline flight completed over 4,000 surveys. These surveys provided detailed information on how long commercial visitors stay per trip and how much they spend during each visit for hotels, food, ground transportation, entertainment, and retail shopping. Spending by commercial visitor trip differs by airport. Spending patterns per trip for each airport are presented in the study's technical report. Let's walk through an example of how direct economic impacts resulting from commercial visitor spending were estimated. Don't forget, for this category, direct output is equal to annual commercial visitor spending. For our example, the airport has 50,000 employments that are visitors. Do not forget that these 50,000 visitor employments are only a percentage of the airport's total annual employments. The remainder of the employments are residents. For this example, for each trip, the visitor spent on average $500. Again, it is important to remember that other visitors had expenditures per trip that were both above and below this average amount. To continue, if each of the 50,000 visitors spent $500 on average per trip, this results in $25 million in annual commercial visitor spending. The $25 million is also equal to direct output in the commercial visitor category. Similar to direct output for the general aviation visitors, direct output from visitors arriving on commercial airlines is equal to the annual spending the visitors have while in the state. In our example, the Input-Output model is also used to determine the number of jobs and payroll that are supported by the estimated $25 million in direct commercial visitor output or spending. For every $85,000 in commercial visitor spending, one job is supported. So in our example, $25 million divided by $85,000 shows that the commercial visitor spending is supporting 294 direct jobs. These jobs have annual direct payroll of $7,350,000, assuming an average salary of $25,000 for each job. So for our example, the 50,000 visitors support annual direct output, or spending, of $25 million. This direct output, using ratios from the Implant Model, supports 294 direct jobs that have an annual payroll of $7,350,000. So we have covered direct impacts for all of the impact categories: airport management, airport tenants, capital investment, general aviation visitors, and commercial visitors. Now we will switch our focus to indirect impacts. Once direct impacts enter the economy, they generate successive waves of additional economic impacts that are classified in this study as indirect impacts. If you look at your airport's individual impacts, you will see that direct and indirect impacts are shown separately. Indirect impacts are sometimes referred to as multiplier impacts, or as impacts that are generated by multipliers. The best way to understand indirect impacts is through example. When an airport employee is paid, they use their salary earned at the airport to pay a doctor, buy groceries, and pay for daycare. While the airport employee is not supporting the entire job of the person they pay, they support a portion of the person's job. These portions of jobs are the ones that add up to the indirect jobs shown for the various impact categories. In this study, each airport's total annual economic impact is the big number that we talked about at the onset of this discussion. Once all direct impacts are estimated, these impacts are entered into an input-output model. For this project, the Implant Model was used to estimate total annual impacts for each airport. For all airports, when total economic impacts are estimated using the Implant Model, the difference between total impacts and direct impacts are the indirect impacts. Implan is an acronym for Impact Analysis for Planning. The model was developed more than 35 years ago and is approved by the FAA for use in estimating aviation-related economic impacts. All input-output models estimate the interdependencies between various economic sectors. The Implant Model was selected for use in this study because the data that the model is built on is the most current of all models available. Also, the Implant Model can be customized so that it reflects specific conditions in each North Dakota county. The study's technical report provides more discussion on the Implant Model for those seeking more information. The Implant Model was used in several ways in this study. The model was used to 1. Convert direct output for capital investments into the number of direct jobs and payroll that the output supports. 2. Convert direct output for visitor spending into the number of direct jobs and payroll that the output supports. 3. Estimate, considering all direct impacts, each airport's total annual economic impact. 4. Measure indirect impacts in all categories for employment, payroll, and output. Indirect impact is the difference between total and direct impact. In the process to estimate each airport's total annual economic impact, inputs were made into the Implant Model for employment, payroll, and output. Separate inputs were made for airport management, airport tenants, capital investment, and both categories of visitor spending. Within each of these categories, sub-inputs are also needed. Each entry made by the modeler considers the type of input and the location of the direct impact within North Dakota. The model used in this study was built to specifically consider economic conditions in each North Dakota county. Therefore, the relationship between direct and total economic impact differs according to the area of the state where the impact is taking place. The same is true for the type of impact: employment, payroll, or output. Further, the relationship between direct and total impacts vary between airport management, airport tenants, capital investment, and both categories of visitor spending. The relationship between direct and total impacts even varies within the category. For instance, within the visitor spending category, there is a more positive correlation, or in other words, there is a higher multiplier between direct spending in restaurants than there is for spending in the retail category. In the restaurant category, more goods and services to supply these businesses have more likely come from within North Dakota. In the retail sector, most items purchased have been manufactured outside the state, and more likely, even outside the country. So there is a smaller economic return to the state's economy for visitor spending in the retail category. Data entries into the model help to make all of these distinctions. There is no one-size-fits-all multiplier in this process, And in fact, the models considered hundreds of different multipliers to produce the final economic impact estimates. We have shown several examples for direct impacts. Now let's go over an example that shows direct, indirect, and total impacts. Let's go back to our example for direct airport management. We had 2 direct jobs, $96,000 in annual direct payroll, and $150,000 in direct output. As a refresher, output in this category is the purchase of goods and services to run the airport. In the example, you can see that the 2 direct jobs, once entered into the Implant Model, support 3 total jobs. There is 1 indirect job supported by the 2 direct jobs. The Implant Model estimates total jobs, and hence enables us to determine how many indirect jobs are supported. If you go back to the example of the airport worker using their salary earned at the airport to pay the doctor, buy groceries, and pay for daycare, when all portions of jobs supported are summed, the 2 direct jobs at the airport support 1 other job in the community. The example shows how the model estimated similar total and indirect impacts in the payroll and output categories. This example also shows the implied multiplier in each of the 3 categories. In reality, the model uses many multipliers to estimate total impacts. What you see in this example is the final combination or average of all multipliers considered in the process. The implied multiplier is derived by dividing total impacts by direct impacts. Here's another example of direct, indirect, and total impacts for our previous example of direct impacts in the commercial visitor category. The process is the same here. Direct impacts are entered into Implant. The model, considering the type of input and location of the input, then estimates total economic impact, which in turn enables us to show what portion of each airport's total economic impacts are related to the indirect activities that are supported by the direct activities. All of the airport and statewide economic impacts presented in various portions of North Dakota's statewide economic impact study were developed using a statewide model. For informational purposes, 2 different sets of annual economic impacts for each airport were developed in the study. One set of impacts shows the airport's impact on the entire state economy, and the other set of impacts shows the airport's impact on just its immediate local economy. For larger airports, their impact on the state economy is the same or similar to their impact on their local county or MSA economy. For smaller airports in more rural locations, these airports have a lower impact on the local economy than they have on the statewide economy. The difference between the state and local economic impacts is a result of where you can buy the goods and services you need. As an example, let's say you are a small general aviation airport that is about 90 minutes from a larger city in North Dakota. You may not be able to purchase all of the goods and services you need in your immediate local area, but you can still make these purchases elsewhere in North Dakota. The difference between state and local impacts is fairly simple. Local economic impacts show what can be purchased in the local area. State impacts show not only what can be purchased locally, but what also can be purchased within the state. The difference between an airport's local and state impacts shows purchases that took place elsewhere in North Dakota. Information in Appendix A of the technical report is available for all airports who wish to see the difference between the economic impact they have on the North Dakota economy versus the economic impact they have on just the economy of the airport's local market area. This example shows how an airport's economic impacts might differ when using the local or county model for the airport versus using the state model. Let's look at the output category. Using the state model, total annual output for the airport management category is estimated at $262,000. When just the local or county model is used, the total output for the airport management category is $205,000. What this implies is that $57,000 of the total annual output was not realized in the local area, but was still realized elsewhere within the state. Again, the local impacts for each airport are presented in Appendix A for those airports who would like to have this information. It is important to restate that all of the impacts, statewide and airport-specific, reported in the state study were developed using the state model. We hope this tutorial provides you with a better understanding of how economic impacts for your airport were estimated. There are additional tools including a statewide executive summary, a study fact sheet, and an individual report for your airport that can be used to support your efforts to discuss with others the important economic impacts of your airport and all airports in North Dakota. If you have additional questions on the study methodology, please contact the Aeronautics Commission. They will be able to assist you.